The night my father handed me a check for $10,000 and told me to disappear, I thought it was the worst moment of my life. I was 21 years old, standing in the foyer of a house I had grown up in, marble floors, chandelier overhead, the faint smell of my mother's old perfume still caught somewhere in the curtains. My younger brother stood 2 steps behind me, 19 and quiet, his jaw set in that way he had whenever he was trying not to cry. Our father, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who shook hands with senators and got his photo taken at charity galas, stood across from us holding 2 envelopes, one for each of us. "You're adults now," he said. "The company is restructuring. This is more than generous." He didn't yell. He never yelled. That was the thing about my father. He did everything with the calm of a man who had never once been told no. I looked at the check. $10,000. For 21 years. My brother, I'll call him by his nickname, the same one our grandfather had given him when he was 4, Bug, looked at me across the foyer. I folded the envelope and put it in my jacket pocket. Bug did the same. Neither of us said a word. We walked out through the front door, down the pebbled driveway, and got into my truck. We sat there in the dark for a long moment. "Where do we go?" Bug asked. I had no answer. Not yet. What most people didn't know. What my father had worked very hard to make sure people didn't know was that he had not built Callaway Industries from nothing. He had inherited it from his father-in-law, from our grandfather on our mother's side, a man named Edmund, who had passed away when I was 16 and Bug was 14. Edmund had built a regional construction and land development company across rural Kentucky and southern Ohio over 4 decades. When he died, the business passed to my father as the only male heir willing to take it. Our mother had died 2 years before Edmund, a car accident on a wet highway in November. My father mourned publicly and moved on privately, faster than most people thought was appropriate, though no one said so to his face. We had lived well because of Edmund's work. We went to good schools, drove decent cars, wore the right clothes. But Edmund himself had been simple. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup. He wore flannel shirts to Sunday church. He kept a small farm property outside a town called Dunmore in eastern Kentucky. 43 acres, a farmhouse, an old equipment shed, and at the far edge of the property, near a stand of cedar trees, a cinder block storage building that he had built sometime in the late 90s. He called it the Annex. Nobody else called it anything at all, because nobody else went there. After Edmund died, my father had taken the farm property as part of the estate. He'd talked about developing it, then never did. It just sat there on the books. I knew the address by heart because Edmund had taken me there twice as a kid, just the 2 of us, and both times he'd walked me around the property like he was showing me something he wanted me to remember. The second time, I was 14. He stood at the door of the annex with a padlock in his hand and said, "You know, the things worth keeping aren't always the things worth showing." I hadn't known what he meant. I was 14. Now, sitting in a dark truck in my father's driveway at 21 with an envelope containing a $10,000 check and nowhere to go, I thought about it for the first time in years. "I think we should drive to Dunmore," I said. Bug looked at me. "That's 5 hours, I know." He didn't argue. He pulled his seatbelt on. We drove through the night. I had a half tank of gas, a bag of chips from a gas station outside Lexington, and a phone charger that only worked if you held the cord at a specific angle. Bug slept in the passenger seat somewhere past Moorhead. I kept the radio on low. One of those late-night country stations that plays old stuff, Merle Haggard, Conway Twitty, and I thought about my grandfather. Edmund wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't go in for long speeches or emotional displays. But he remembered things. He remembered that I liked my eggs scrambled, not fried, and that Bug was scared of thunderstorms until he was 11, and that our mother used to hum while she did the dishes. He remembered the names of our teachers and our friends, and the towns where our baseball tournaments were held. He paid attention in a way that my father never did and never pretended to. When our mother died, Edmund was the one who sat with us. Not at the funeral, but after. The Tuesday morning 2 weeks later, when everyone had gone back to their lives and the house felt like a museum. He drove 4 hours from Dunmore, let himself in with the spare key, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with us until noon. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. I missed him in a way that was still raw even 5 years later. I pulled off the main highway onto a county road just before sunrise, the kind of road where the yellow center line disappears in places and the trees grow close on both sides. Bug woke up when the truck rattled over a cattle crossing. "Are we close?" he asked. 10 minutes. The farm property sat at the end of a gravel drive marked by 2 fieldstone posts and a rusted mailbox that still had Edmund's name on it. No one had ever changed it. I stopped at the gate. There was a chain and a padlock. I had the spare key to the main farmhouse on my keyring, the one Edmund had given me the summer I turned 16, pressed into my palm at the end of a visit with no ceremony whatsoever. I'd kept it because it seemed like the kind of thing you kept. But the gate padlock was different. I didn't have a key for that. Bug got out and examined it. It was old, the kind with a 4-digit combination dial. He looked at me over the hood of the truck. "Any ideas?" I thought about Edmund. His birthday was October 3rd. I tried 1003. Nothing. His wife, our grandmother Lucille, had died in 1987. I tried 1987. Nothing. I stood there in the early morning cold. It was late March, the Kentucky hills still bare and brown, and I thought about what mattered to him. Our mother, Eleanor. She was born June 18th, 1961. I tried 0618. The lock opened. Bug stared at it. Neither of us said anything. I put the lock in my jacket pocket and we drove through. The farmhouse was cold and dusty but structurally sound. Edmund had kept it maintained through a local property management company. The pipes hadn't burst, the roof was intact, and there was a stack of firewood on the back porch under a tarp that was only slightly rotted through. We got a fire going in the wood stove in the kitchen, ate the last of the gas station chips, and slept a few hours on the couch and the love seat. When I woke up, the sun was high. Bug was standing at the kitchen window looking out toward the back of the property. "The annex is still there," he said. I already knew it was. We found it the way I remembered. A squat cinder block building maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, painted an institutional gray that had weathered to almost nothing. A single metal door, no windows. Padlock on a hasp. Weeds grown up around the foundation. A cedar tree had dropped a limb against the back wall at some point, and nobody had moved it. The padlock here was keyed. I tried the farmhouse key. Wrong cut. I tried every other key on my ring. Nothing. Bug walked around the perimeter. "There's no other way in." I stood there looking at the door. Something Edmund had said was pulling at the back of my mind. Not the thing about keeping and showing, but something else, something smaller and more specific. We'd been standing at his truck once, loading fence posts, and he'd said almost to himself, "People hide the important things where nobody thinks to look for them, not in safes, on safes, behind calendars, under the floorboard by the back door." I turned around and walked back to the farmhouse. The back door, the one that opened from the kitchen to the porch, had a small mat in front of it, rubber-backed, the kind you find at every farm supply store in the country. I lifted it. Nothing. I looked at the door frame. Nothing. Then I crouched and looked at the threshold itself. There was a tiny gap between the threshold and the wood flooring, a deliberate gap that shouldn't have been there. I pulled out my pocket knife and worked the blade in, a small brass key on a wire loop. Bug was leaning in the doorway behind me. He didn't say a word. I stood up and we walked back to the annex together, and I put the key in the padlock and it opened on the first try. Inside was dark until Bug found a battery-powered work lantern hanging from a hook just inside the door, the kind Edmund would have kept fully charged. It still worked. The space was clean, not dusty clean, the way abandoned places get, but actually maintained. A dehumidifier unit sat in the corner. Bug checked it and found the reservoir nearly full, which meant it had been running until relatively recently, probably until the power to the property had been put on minimal service. Metal shelving units along 2 walls. A folding table in the center, and on the table a fireproof document box with a combination lock, and beside it, sealed in a gallon-sized Ziploc bag, an envelope with my name on it, my full name. Not a nickname, not initials. My full name in Edmund's handwriting, which was the old-fashioned kind with real penmanship, the kind they don't teach anymore. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked it up. Inside the envelope were two things: a handwritten letter, 2 pages, front and back, and a smaller slip of paper with a 6-digit number written on it. I read the letter standing up because my legs didn't cooperate enough to sit down. Edmund had written it 3 months before he died. He had known he was sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, the kind that doesn't leave you much runway, and he had made arrangements accordingly. The letter explained what was in the document box, which the 6-digit number would open. It explained why he had not included these things in his formal estate, processed through my father's attorneys. It explained what he had learned about how my father had been managing the company in the years after our mother died. I won't repeat everything he wrote. Some of it was private, the kind of thing a grandfather says to a grandson that isn't meant for anyone else. But the relevant part was this: Edmund had discovered, approximately 18 months before his death, that my father had been systematically misclassifying construction contracts, marking residential developments as agricultural projects to qualify for federal rural development subsidies he wasn't entitled to. He had also been using the company to funnel payments to a county zoning official who had approved several projects that should never have been permitted. The amounts were not trivial. Edmund had spent the last year of his life quietly documenting it. Paper contracts, bank records, emails printed and organized by date, the name and contact information for a federal investigator at the HUD Office of Inspector General who Edmund had spoken to once, informally, before he got too sick to continue. Edmund had not gone to the authorities himself. He wrote that he was afraid of what my father might do to protect himself, and that he didn't have the strength left to fight a war. But he believed that one day my brother and I would need leverage, and he had prepared it for us. "I hope you never need this," he wrote at the bottom of the second page. "But if you're reading it, it means you do. Use it well, use it carefully, and don't let him make you into something you're not." Bug had been reading over my shoulder. When I lowered the letter, he walked to the far wall and stood there for a minute with his back to me. "How much documentation is in the box?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet." He turned around. His eyes were red, but his voice was level. "Open it." The box contained 3 inches of organized documents. Edmund had been meticulous. There were contract comparison sheets showing the misclassification pattern across 14 separate projects. There were bank statements with transfers highlighted in yellow marker. There were printed emails, my father communicating with the zoning official using what appeared to be a secondary email account, and there were 2 signed statements from former employees, notarized, describing what they had witnessed. Edmund had also included a handwritten timeline, cross-referencing dates and amounts, the way an accountant thinks, which is what he had been before he went into construction. Bug photographed every page with his phone while I read. We spent 3 hours in that cinder block building. When we were done, Bug had backup copies in 2 cloud accounts, and I had the physical documents in the fireproof box. I sat on the cold concrete floor with my back against the shelving unit. "We need a lawyer," I said. "We need a lawyer we can afford," Bug said. "We have $20,000 between us. Then we need to be smart about who we call." We drove back to the farmhouse, and I made the call I had been thinking about for the past 3 hours. The federal investigator Edmund had named in the letter. I looked up the HUD OIG field office and called the main line and asked for the specific name. After 2 transfers and a hold that lasted long enough for me to drink an entire cup of bad instant coffee, a woman came on the line. I told her who I was. I told her my grandfather's name. There was a pause on the other end. "I remember him," she said quietly. I said we had documentation. She said she wanted to see it. She gave me a secure email address and told me to send scans that same day and not to discuss the matter with anyone else until we had spoken again. I sent everything. She called back within 4 hours. I won't go into the detail of what followed over the next 3 months, partly because some of it is still in legal record. and partly because a lot of it involved a great deal of waiting in bland offices while men and women in professional clothing discussed things in language designed to obscure more than reveal. What I can tell you is this. The HUD OIG opened a formal investigation. They had, it turned out, already had some preliminary interest in two of the projects Edmund had flagged, but not enough to move on. Our documentation changed that. There were attorneys involved, the government's, and eventually ours, funded in part by a whistleblower provision that Bug had researched online at 1 in the morning and asked about on our first call with the investigator. She confirmed we were likely eligible. The process was slow and at times genuinely frightening, because my father had resources and lawyers of his own, and there were weeks where it felt like nothing was happening, and I lay awake at night in the farmhouse, listening to coyotes in the cedar woods, and wondering if Edmund had been wrong to trust us with this. He wasn't wrong. The moment I think about most, when I look back on all of it, happened on a Thursday afternoon in late October at a groundbreaking ceremony for a new development project. Ironic, given everything, that my father was publicly headlining. He had been positioning himself for a county commissioner's seat. There were local news cameras. There were folding chairs on a construction site and a podium and a small crowd of people who thought they knew who my father was. I wasn't there in person. I didn't need to be. The federal agents were. My brother and I watched from a live stream on Bug's phone, sitting on the tailgate of my truck on the edge of the farm property. We watched two men in dark jackets approach the podium just as my father stepped to the microphone. We watched the expression on his face, and I know that face. I have studied that face my whole life. I know every register of it. Go from practiced confidence to something I had never seen there before. Uncertainty. Real, unmanaged human uncertainty. He was arrested without incident. His attorney was on the phone before the handcuffs were on. Bug said nothing for a long moment. Then, Grandpa would have hated that they did it in front of the cameras. Yeah, I said. He would have, but he would have understood why. The legal outcome took another 8 months to fully resolve. My father pleaded guilty to 2 federal charges: fraudulent misrepresentation in federal subsidy applications and conspiracy to commit bribery. The zoning official pleaded guilty separately. The company was restructured under court supervision. There were civil penalties and restitution requirements that consumed most of what remained of its assets. My father was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and will be on probation for 5 years after his release. Bug and I received a whistleblower award, a percentage of the government's recovery, which was substantial enough to be genuinely life-changing. I'm not going to name the specific amount because I was raised to believe that discussing money in specific terms is the province of people who have something to prove. What I will say is that it was enough to pay off the student loans we both still carried and to buy the farm property outright from the estate. Something Edmund had, according to his letter, always intended for one of us to do. We kept the property. Bug lives in the farmhouse now. I'm 26 miles down the road in a house I own. We have Sunday dinners most weeks when schedules allow. The annex is still standing. We cleaned it out, replaced the dehumidifier, and use it for actual storage now. Lumber, equipment, the kind of ordinary things a working property needs. The metal shelving is still there. The hook where the lantern hung is still there. I haven't taken Edmund's letter out of the fireproof box since the day we read it. It stays there on the top shelf, in a Ziploc bag, exactly where we left it. Some things you keep not because you need to read them again, but because you need to know they exist. My father had a phrase he used when he wanted to dismiss something he didn't want to deal with. He'd say, "That's not relevant to the current conversation." He said it to contractors, to employees, to lawyers. He said it to our mother once or twice, in a tone I still remember. He never said it to Edmund. I always wondered why. I think I know now. I think Edmund was the one person in my father's life who my father understood, on some level he could not dismiss. Edmund had built something real. Edmund had kept records. Edmund had raised a daughter my father had never deserved and had watched him with clear eyes for 20 years. Edmund had been patient. He had waited. And when the time came, he had made sure the people he trusted most had exactly what they needed. No giant is too big to fall. You just have to be willing to hold the thing that brings it down, and to hold it carefully and long enough, and with the right people beside you. Bug was the right person. He always was. That's the part I'm most grateful for, not the outcome, not the resolution, not even the letter. It's that I didn't have to do any of it alone. Edmund knew that too. That's why the envelope had my name on it, but the letter inside was written to both of us.